Hello, welcome once again to Macro 2.0, a series about big ideas, big institutions, and big money. And today, as always, Barry Nielsen from Opportunity Bank is joining me here for a conversation about those things. And this is sort of our wrap-up session. We've been going for a number of episodes talking about specific topics, each one of them attached to a big idea or a big institution, and always about big money. So we're taking the macro view. But this is our opportunity to sort of sum things up in our own ways. So each of us is going to have the opportunity to talk about their takeaways, the big takeaways. So we're going to start with you, Barry, and your big idea, the one you're leaving the series with still in mind. And then we'll bounce back and forth as we go through the three categories.
Okay. Excellent. First, I do want to say thank you so much for having me, this being our last show. Thank you so much for having me. I very much enjoyed this.
Likewise, our pleasure.
And it's been great and much appreciated, so thank you very much. For my first topic, to kind of summarize what we've talked about over the last several weeks and tie things together, I wanted to talk about as an idea, an economic concept, asset allocation and productivity. Because as
heavy terms.
Yes, yeah. Or I shouldn't say, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Not asset allocation, but the efficient allocation of capital and resources and productivity. As we talked about a couple weeks ago or last week, productivity is the key to increasing our standard of living. Mm-hmm. And as you defined it very well, productivity is an increase in output for the same amount of input. So as productivity increases, we get more with the same amount of input, and our standard of living increases. The automobile, the airplane, the computer, software, a number of things that make our lives easier, better, more efficient, and increases our wealth individually and as a nation. And the key to productivity is the efficient allocation of capital. Now, I will say, from the productivity growth, the annual rate of growth of productivity for the last 10 years has been, by historical standards, low. Uh-huh. From 1995 to 2007, productivity in the United States grew at an annual rate of 2.7%. From 2008 to today, productivity growth has fallen to an average annual rate of 1.3%. So that difference doesn't seem like a lot, but it's the same as interest on a savings account. In this case, 1.4% year after year after year. Yeah. That's compounded. That makes a big difference. So the question to ask is, and it's confounded economists and policymakers for the last several years, why has productivity growth been low for the last 10 years, coming out of the great financial crisis? Yeah. And I've heard Alan Greenspan talk about this quite a lot lately, about the importance of productivity in raising our standard of living. And I would add, it raises the quality of goods. And also throw in there that environmental quality is a big issue, obviously, for us, and for a very important issue for a lot of people. But productivity is the key to increasing our environmental quality. I mean, to build the same car that uses less energy to run and has fewer emissions. Productivity gains are the things that lead to that. That can also lead to our quality of life as measured by a number of different things that we talked about.
All these indices of well-being.
That's right, yeah, that we talked about. So I would say that, this has been a topic that as I see Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, talk about quite a lot lately is the efficient allocation of capital and resources as it creates productivity growth. So we need to ask, are we in an environment where we're not allocating capital and resources as efficiently as we once did or could? And I would say yes, and this is kind of my big idea, and I'm going to go out and say that I blame that on some government policy coming out of the financial crisis. Okay.
So, and we're talking about the allocation of capital to engender productivity increases. You're talking about financial capital, human capital, all forms of capital, you know, any kind of economic resource.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And what policy would you like to illustrate or point to as maybe the main culprit in slowing down this productivity growth?
Well, they're very related. I have three issues I'm going to mention real quickly. One, we bailed everybody out coming out of the financial crisis. The government backstopped everybody. They did not allow institutions to fail. They did not allow individuals to fail. Those institutions and individuals had made poor risk management decisions, poor economic and business decisions that were exposed during the financial crisis. And instead of, I'm going to throw an economic term out there, instead of letting the process of creative destruction take place, they kept the old growth alive and did not allow for new growth. And new growth is vital in creating economic efficiencies and new ways of doing things and better ways of doing things and allocating resources efficiently. That was distorted by some of those government policies, or many of those government policies during the and coming out of the great financial crisis. Now, many would argue that there were reasons we needed those desperately, but they're call it a side effect, call it whatever you want. It's had an impact. And another illustration of that, or another thing would be, once as an institution, once you get backstopped or bailed out, or however you want to phrase it, by the federal government is going to demand that they regulate you, that they examine you.
Yeah.
And in doing so, they create an enormous amount of costs for you to do business.
That's the take after the give.
That's right. And I was going to say a drag on business. Maybe not a drag, but it's a cost. I'll call it an inefficiency. Now, in hand with that is that once you have to incur all those additional costs and expertise to be able to comply with new government regulation and examinations and policies, it creates barriers to entry.
Right.
It's harder for new businesses to enter your industry, and finance or banking is a perfect example of that. We went for nearly 10 years, I think, with only one new bank being started in the United States.
Really?
One new bank.
Yeah.
And that's a good example of that. On top of that, it creates an environment where an industry or a company or corporation's comparative advantage comes from their relationship to the federal government, to their ability to lobby the federal government, to their ability to lobby Congress and the regulatory agencies, not from their ability to produce a fabulous product.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly that's a big part of it, but
So they're using up all these resources, financial and human resources, to comply with regulations and also to win favor with the big kahuna that's backstopping them, whether they're operating efficiently and effectively or not. They're too big to fail. That's a phrase that everybody knows, you know, and that's a slightly different issue, but I think you're sort of talking about that. They were deemed to be too big to fail, so we're not going to let them fail. And now we're in this world where it's kind of a revolving relationship, interdependent relationship between the government as financier and the institution as a business.
And of course we still have a market-based capital, we still practice capitalism, but I would say that those policies have stifled some productivity and have prevented some amount of the efficient allocation of capital and resources. And if you want to end it there, we can end it there and move on to the next. But that was my my big idea to discuss in our finale here.
Well, I appreciate that. It's a huge idea, and it sort of it penetrates everything in our economy. You know, this whole notion of productivity and improving productivity is the way to improve anything and everything in the material world. You know, I'm not going to argue that at all. My big idea is different from that, and that's this phenomenon called globalization. And I'm not going to dwell too much on it because it's pretty obvious to most people that, yeah, our economy, the United States economy, is more interdependent with other nations' economies more than ever in our memory. I will remind people that there was a greater degree of interdependence and globalization within Europe before the First World War than there is even today. Mm-hmm. So we have this high degree of interdependence and integration, but we've been there before. And as much as I want to say my big idea is that globalization is here to stay, it's not a fancy, you know, it's not a fleet of fancy, it's not temporal, it's going to continue, it's quasi-permanent. I'm admitting right off the get-go, well, actually, no, nothing's permanent. It can come apart. And I'm a big fan of globalization, but I want to acknowledge that I can see, like so many other people, that hyper-globalization is too much of a good thing. So when too many economic relationships hinge on consensus or, you know, relationships across the globe, lots of things can go wrong. In addition to that, globalization has paid more dividends to the wealthy individuals, but more importantly, the largest corporations on the planet are the ones that have benefited the most from globalization. We as consumers, here in America especially, benefit even from that huge business advantage because using productivity, you know, in the midst of all these companies and figuring out how to source labor and materials from a global platform rather than try and find it all here at home, we benefit because we can buy goods much more cheaply, better goods much more cheaply because of globalized markets. And I'm fascinated by global supply chains, like in the automobile industry or even, you know, in the electronics, consumer electronics. These products that we rely on, digital devices and cars, they're put together from people and parts from all over the world. And I find that fascinating and attractive in a way, but again, acknowledge that we can go too far. And there have to be measures that sort of limit the degree of globalization that occurs, because you go too far, you've lost sovereignty or you've lost freedom. And so I'll stop with that. I think it's an idea that's dominant in my head, partly as a consequence of these conversations, but beyond that, it's sort of like globalization is this big idea that's happening. It's happened before. It seems to be going strong, but there are all kinds of forces and energies now directed against it. Not everybody likes it as much as I do.
Yeah.
Because it has its flaws.
Yeah, my point to that would be, as we've discussed, in aggregate, global trade, globalization may be viewed as good, but it can create a lot of local pain. Yeah. When you've had a 30-year career in producing a certain machine part and all of a sudden somebody in the Far East can produce it at half your wage, that's hard to make a career change 30 years into your career. Yeah. So it can cause local pain. But
yeah, I totally accept that and won't drag this out. I will say that, you know, there have been government policies designed to mitigate the pain that you're speaking to, especially of job losses, you know, but they're pitifully financed, these job retraining programs, and they're sort of a concept that's hard to act out anyway.
Yeah.
To retrain somebody after 30 years
Yeah.
on a factory floor and train them out to be something completely different, it's probably unrealistic. So I think there's a widespread acknowledgement about this problem of localized pain and aggregate gain, and people are working on it.
That's a very good way to say it. I like that.
Yeah. So we're gonna move on to big institution, and I'm gonna start because I'm gonna talk about global institution. And we haven't really spent much time talking about this at all, but the World Trade Organization is this international organization where sovereign governments agree to meet together and establish rules of trade, so that if there are disputes, which there are many in trade, about unfair subsidies, about intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, that's what's going on with China these days. The World Trade Organization is designed to handle those disputes in a professional way. So it's comprised, the staff, the secretariat of this organization is staffed by highly educated, highly trained professional people who try to settle disputes. And it's worked fairly well, and the United States has done very well at the World Trade Organization. When complaints have been lodged against us, or we've complained against some other country, the settlement is usually in the United States' favor. But currently, the institution has fallen out of favor. There's a lot of criticism. I'm merely wanting to plug the legitimacy and the effectiveness of this global trade agency in the context of globalization. That the merits of globalization are best preserved by having an institution of this nature. So that's it. But I'm sure you might have something to say about WTO.
Well, I don't. I don't have a lot of expertise there. I would ask you a question for the benefit of our viewers and everything. Is the United States fairly and well represented there?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I mean, today is an anomalous situation where the United States government has declined to appoint American judges to these trade dispute panels, which gums up the works. And that's a way of delegitimizing the institution by not allowing it to work. But it's the United States playing against itself in a way by not allowing it to go forward and using national trade laws in lieu of agreements at the international level. We're resorting to domestic trade laws that are still on the books, and they're designed to protect national security, to protect industries. So we're sort of, in my view, have taken a retrograde step away from this global platform back onto a national one, and it's part and parcel of our trade wars and trade disputes with our allies, the Europeans, the Canadians, the Japanese, the Chinese, everybody. So I think the United States is well represented when it wants to be.
Yeah.
And WTO is largely a creation of American thinking, American ideas.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know a whole heck of a lot about it, but if it promotes free trade and enforces the rules of free trade and tries to ensure that everybody plays on that level playing field of free trade, free market principles, I'm in favor of it.
Okay, I'm counting you as a fan then, because that's what it's designed to do anyway. So let's move away from the global stage, although we can't completely do that, even by talking about the institution, the big institution of your choice.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the Federal Reserve, U.S. Federal Reserve System. That's something that I don't think we've had a discussion over the last several weeks where that didn't come up each week at some point. I wanted to talk about the fact that the Federal Reserve took, in their own words, extraordinary measures following and during the great financial crisis about 10 years ago. They lowered interest rates to near 0%, or actually 0%, short-term interest rates, the federal funds rate, and they bought over $4 trillion worth of U.S. Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities under a program called quantitative easing. And when they bought those bonds, over $4 trillion worth, they literally printed money. And their goal was to stimulate economic activity, borrowing and lending, low interest rate environment, easy money policies that would in turn stimulate investment and business activity. Another stated goal of theirs, which they called the portfolio balance channel strategy, was by pushing interest rates so low on short-term interest rates and longer-term interest rates as they bought all of those bonds with printed money to force the rate of return or the yield on those bonds so low that investors who traditionally rely upon investments in treasury bonds and CDs and T-bills would be forced into more risky investments, stocks, if you will, and other risky assets to really, again, to stimulate risk-taking, there was a great lack of confidence after the great financial crisis or during or as a result of the great financial crisis. So they wanted to stimulate risk-taking, which is the key to, in a market economy, the key to economic growth. And in doing so, they undoubtedly created some asset bubbles. We don't know exactly where they are. Many analysts refer to the current environment as the everything bubble.
Yeah.
You've already mentioned one, I think. It could be student loans.
Student loan debt, housing again, perhaps.
Maybe, yeah, sure.
We know in the past there have been tech bubbles. Yeah, I've seen this terminology of everything conceivably is in a bubble state. Yes,
and you could make an argument that bonds themselves are in a bubble state. Because again, they bought $4.3 or $5 trillion worth of bonds and stocks. And we've seen here recently over the last couple months the tremendous volatility in the stock market. And that is taking place as the Federal Reserve and other global central banks have begun to unwind those extraordinary monetary policies, including quantitative easing. And now they're calling it quantitative tightening, where they're allowing the bonds held in their portfolio, which again they bought with printed money, to mature and as they say run off, and it's causing tighter monetary conditions. So, at least to me, it seems logical that if during the process of lowering short-term interest rates to zero and creating all this liquidity and printing all this money through quantitative easing, which drove asset prices, when you unwind those policies or allow those policies to unwind, it's going to have the opposite impact.
Yeah.
Now, that was a grand experiment that the Fed undertook over the last 10 years. And I think that in 2019, we're going to see how that experiment ends. And I'm not making predictions that it's going to be, stocks are going to fall dramatically and home prices are going to crash and auto lending is going to be a huge problem like housing lending was, mortgage lending was 10 years ago. But I do think that there is going to be an opposite impact as quantitative tightening takes place, and the Fed has been raising short-term interest rates off of that zero level at an increasing rate over the last couple of years, and that's become a big issue. Where do short-term interest rates go in 2019? The Fed is going to be at the center of attention as an institution in 2019, and we're going to see how that extraordinary, in their own words, extraordinary monetary policy ends or unwinds.
Yeah. Well, this brings us sort of, all these things are intertwined.
Absolutely.
And as you're talking about the Federal Reserve, and I'm recalling that during this period of extraordinary measures, they were also providing liquidity to the rest of the world at unprecedented levels.
Yes.
So in effect, and I'm kind of swinging back to this idea of globalization,
Yeah.
and sticking everything in it, the Federal Reserve is in effect the central bank of the world.
Yeah.
You know, every nation state has its own central bank, but what the Fed does affects everybody else. And as we speak, as the unwinding is happening and as interest rates are being very gradually increased, but systematically brought up, that has an effect on global financial markets, which is going to get us to, I think, the big money idea or the big money issue or category, where I think we're going to land on the same place, and that's the role of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. So as these interest rates increase, capital flows to where the returns are highest in a capital fluid world. So as the interest rates in the United States increase, more and more foreign investors are going to put more of their resources into dollar-denominated assets and into dollars themselves, which raises the relative value of the dollar vis-a-vis everybody else's currency, which puts our exports on the downside, but at the same time, it sort of upholds this whole notion that the United States is still in charge of the global economy.
You're
that's
absolutely
overstating
right.
it.
No, but you're absolutely right, and that you did a very good job there of tying the institution, the Fed, and their monetary policy into how it impacts global trade, because you're absolutely right. Short-term interest rates and interest rates in general and the prospects of the U.S. economy play a huge role on exchange rates. And when the Fed raises rates, which they have over the last year and project that they will continue to do in 2019, that in theory raises the value of the dollar, because just as you said, global investors seek the highest yielding assets, the highest interest rates, or relative interest rates, and so money flows into U.S. denominated assets. And that pushes up our currency value, which in turn has an impact on global trade. So as you said, and it said very well, it's all very much interrelated.
And much of the debt held overseas in overseas bank accounts and overseas central banks is dollar denominated. We've talked about that a long time ago in the series about why everything is priced in dollars. Not everything, but big commodities, oil, for example. Everything's priced that way. So as interest rates go up here, that means the cost of repaying those loans increases as well. It's like being on a credit card with a variable rate, and it goes up, true. And you got to pay. You know, you're not going to be forgiven. So it's remarkable to me how intertwined these economies are, and how the Federal Reserve as an institution plays this central role, and in sort of instigating or definitely influencing, more than influencing, the flow of capital across borders, across the globe. And that, of course, has a huge impact on your big idea about where investments in productivity and innovation are made.
Absolutely.
Everything's intertwined in such a high degree.
It is. It absolutely is. And if I might make a point, because I think I said at the beginning of our program several weeks ago that I very much favor free market policies, because it is such a complex system.
Yeah.
Everything is so intertwined and interconnected, and impacts a decision made by the Fed, impacts a toy producer and manufacturer and exporter in Taiwan. That only the free market and all those billions of decisions being made across the world has the computing power. It's like a supercomputer to be able to process that information. Now, there's going to be bad decisions made, but that's the process of creative destruction. And the good decisions come to the front, and that's how we advance productivity. So
Yeah.
I'm trying to tie that all back together.
Yeah, and
But-
as you speak, I'm reminding myself, where in the world today are things going really, really badly? And it's in countries where authority is highly centralized. Where markets aren't allowed to work. At least, micro level, yeah, farmers markets and the bazaar, those aren't influenced. But the big decisions about infrastructure investments, about education, about all the big things that take capital investment, those countries where power is concentrated in one person or a regime, they're in the most trouble. And it's usually, there's political trouble, but there's always an economic root to the problems of these countries. Venezuela, for example, and Sudan right now. And that's bringing me around to, we've sort of hit on our big three, and we're still talking about the dollar, but in the time remaining, I'd like to talk a little bit more about debt. And the global debt, student debt, sovereign debt, corporate debt, high-grade and low-grade corporate debt. If there's one thing that has emerged from our conversation, for me, it's sort of the significance, the enormity of the debt load that's being carried worldwide. And much of that is associated with the United States and the US dollar. We've talked a lot about bubbles. Well, I think a lot of the columnists and financial writers, they're not talking about bubbles anymore. They're talking about bombs. They're like the Chinese debt bomb, the student debt bomb,
Yeah.
Which just sort of conjures up, bubbles pop, but bombs explode. And when there's the bubble is everything, we've got a big debt bomb to wrestle with. And so I'd like to ask you, how do we solve that problem? And do you see it as much of a problem as I'm hinting at?
Well, I like the way you explained that very well. I had never really thought about that, but that's very accurate too. I would also add that a bubble, if you let a bubble go, it floats down. A bomb goes straight down until it hits bottom.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe a bomb is more accurate description.
Very, very heavy bubble.
Yeah. Excuse me. Well, I'm going to tie this back to our discussion on the U.S. dollar. And this is something that you and I have discussed off camera and is concerned to both of us, I think, that our federal debt in the year 2000, I think, was about $5 trillion. In 2008, it was somewhere between $7 to $9 trillion. That was going into the great financial crisis. Today, it stands at $21.9 trillion.
Yeah, it's just astronomical.
It's unsustainable. And as we've talked about, the U.S., and as you've mentioned already today, the U.S. enjoys a great advantage in world trade and commerce, being the world's reserve currency. Whatever it is, 70% of all global trade takes place in U.S. dollars. That gives us tremendous advantage, and that was earned with great sacrifice in 2 world wars and all those men and women that built our economy into what it is today. It's something to be very proud of, but it's something to be concerned about, because that status as the world's reserve currency is contingent very much on the world's confidence in the U.S. dollar.
Yeah.
How does the world lose confidence in the U.S. dollar? It loses confidence in our government institutions. It loses confidence in our economy. And it loses confidence in our ability to maintain and make payment on that tremendous amount of federal debt, which, in preparation, I pulled out a couple statistics. That $21.9 trillion is $65,000 for every person living in the United States. It's $175,000 per household. Interest on that debt is currently about 8% of our total federal expenditures budget. It's projected to surpass next year, I believe, the amount we spend on Medicaid.
Yeah.
It's sometime in the next decade, it's going to surpass the amount we spend on national defense. And this is just the on-book debt. It doesn't even include all those unfunded liabilities of Social Security and Medicaid. At some point, I don't know, how do we dig ourselves out of that hole?
Yeah. I certainly don't have the answer to that. I will comment, though, that some people who sort of used to be very much bothered by debt don't seem to be so much bothered by it now, which, you know, is interesting to me. But in a sense, what they're saying, I'm paraphrasing, is, well, so what? Most of this debt we owe to ourselves. I don't know what sense that makes. And what choice does the world have? In other words, yes, indeed, if the market loses confidence in the U.S. dollar and hence in American institutions and decision making and how we allocate capital, where else can they go? And that's a stumper. It's like, well, yeah, China is in more hock than we are on a per capita basis, and we know their statistics are not reliable. That they're worse off than we think. Economists agree on that. The European Union is frazzled, to say the least. And Brexit's coming up, the British breaking out, and that's going to have a lot of financial ramifications. Already has. In other words, we're it in terms of the reserve currency of even imagination. The Russian ruble's never going to be it. So in other words, I think we're piling up all these debts, and I don't know how they can be forgiven or written off or dissolved in any way other than in an explosion based on a collapse of confidence. That's what worries me is, well, if we keep losing confidence, at some point you don't have enough. You don't trust anything. You don't trust money. The money's not worth anything. And I think we're a long ways from that, but who knows?
Well, you sound to me like you're promoting cryptocurrencies.
Something about which I know precious little, but find fascinating, as I think you do too. A currency that's based on a decentralized set of relationships built on trust and a lot of computing power. A lot of energy goes into it. But it's not fiat currency. It's not created by a government. It's not subject to government regulation yet. So yeah, maybe there's a role for that in terms of bolstering my own sense of security or well-being. I don't know. I haven't invested in it, and I'm not sure I'm going to.
I don't know either, but I think that you and I have done our best to raise the warning flag on the size of the annual federal deficits and the amount of federal debt that's out there, and that is unsustainable. There's a history of in the world of nations that have held that status of reserve currency. We talked about the British pound, Spanish pieces of 8, and they have all gone their way. And we do not want to see the U.S. dollar go its way either, because we can't get spending in Washington under control.
Yeah. Well, I think that's pretty much a good way for us to end this. In other words, projecting forward, trying to analyze what's going to happen, what's the future look like, near term, long term. Our only guide really is history. And I think it's wise for you to counsel to look back. This has happened, these things have happened before. Reserve currencies have plummeted, and wars have destroyed interdependent systems globally more than once. So, scary notion of a sudden collapse in the global economy. It's a scarier notion that a world war would be the thing to be the correction. Talk about a reallocation of capital. It's unimaginable in today's world. So I want to thank you, Barry, for being a part of this program. It's been a pleasure for us to have you here. We're deeply appreciative of Opportunities Bank support, underwriting of the costs of the program. And I'm sad to say we're out of our time and out of our series, but perhaps you'll come up with a new idea for a new series and come back and regale us with more financial acumen.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you for watching Macro 2.0. We'll see you again in some new series sometime soon.